Well, thank you very much for having me. I feel, quite privileged to be here. I'm British by birth, as you can probably tell by the way I speak. I grew up in England, and I was educated at a very militaristic school, where at the age of 17, I gained a flying scholarship from the RAF, the Royal Air Force. At university, I joined the RAF squadron as a cadet pilot, but I resigned from it when I realized that I might be called upon to pilot a bomber, dropping bombs on civilians, had war broken out, and that was in 1966 during the Cold War. I mention this because I recognized the militaristic nature of Australian society as soon as I arrived here in 1970. I arrived shortly before Anzac Day that year, and Anzac Day is a day of annual military pageantry and commemoration. And what surprised me was the level of fervor displayed. I mean, it surprised me at first, but since then I've had time to think about it a bit more. So what I've got today, what I'd like to offer today are my observations about Australian militarism, not as an academic. I'm not an academic. I'm just an ordinary, educated, and I hope thoughtful citizen, one who feels that war is good for nothing except causing damage to infrastructure, institutions, and above all, people. So in a way, this is my attempt to understand for myself what underlies this sort of strange phenomenon that I see in Australian militarism. I'll give a little background to try to explain why Australia is the belligerent nation that it is. I'll give some recent examples of the way in which Australia is becoming nothing more than an adjunct to the USA's military machine. And I'll tell you a little of the history of IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, on whose behalf I'm speaking to you today. Now, modern Australia began as a penal colony, as you know. Convicts were brought here under conditions of extreme cruelty, under British military escort. The first colony was a military prison. Its first governors were all men of the British military forces. And it's worth mentioning in passing that 3 of the last 4 most recent Australian governors general have also all been military men. But Australia's starting point is very significant. The culture of the early colony featured violence and militarism from the very start. And this is reflected in what are referred to as the frontier wars that went on for over 100 years as Indigenous people were dispossessed violently. There are well-documented stories of many appalling massacres and brutality carried out by settlers and British soldiers. In the atmosphere of colonialism at the time, violence was acceptable. It was okay to kill Aboriginal people, especially if they'd helped yourselves to agricultural crops or livestock. And I'll just screen share for a moment and show you a appropriately black and white image depicting one of those massacres. You can see soldiers, they're all in uniform, shooting at Indigenous people falling down the cliffs. Now, of course, this is very much in the tradition of British colonial imperialism. Early modern Australia considered itself almost a part of the mother country, except of course it was actually situated as far away from Britain as it's possible to get. And this leads to a second strand in the story, which is best described by the term fear of abandonment, which also happens to be the title of a very good book on the topic. The first small colony, being a long way from home and not even self-sufficient at first, did feel very vulnerable. There's also a racist element to introduce here as well, because to the north were heavily populated countries filled with people with different skin color, very frightening for white men. So colonial Australia felt isolated, fearful, full of self-doubt, always expecting invasion, and always willing to join a fight. And these features can be seen in the character, a character called Barnacle Bill, who features in a very famous Australian children's book called The Magic Pudding. So I'll just screen share again and show you an image of Barnacle Bill. Here he is. So this guy will always join a fight on principle. Now, as far as I can see, the features that I'm describing have endured in the Australian national psyche to this day. Australians imagine themselves to be vulnerable to invasion, perhaps sensing that other nations might mirror the actions of the British. They've always felt this need for protection. And what developed was a sense that Australia should participate in Britain's wars as a loyal subject of the British Crown, but also in the hope that by assisting Britain, this would guarantee that Britain would reciprocate, should that ever be necessary. So during the colonial years, Australians were all too eager to join in colonial wars elsewhere in the British Empire. In New Zealand, South Africa, China, to give just 3 examples. And I'll screen share again. This is a picture of Australian troops in South Africa. And I'll just blow that up a little bit. These are, as I say, Australian troops serving in South Africa during the Boer War at the turn of the 19th century. This tradition reached its height during the First World War, when Australians did make enormous sacrifices on the battlefield, out of all proportion of any risk to the nation. And again, I'll screen share to show you a picture of the devastation of one of the battlefields of the First World War. I think this was, I can't remember the name of the battlefield now, but never mind, they're all the same, total destruction, wounded and dead lying everywhere, few people looking after the survivors. Total devastation. This is what war does. So the next thing I want to mention is that Australia transitioned from being a colony to being an independent nation more or less seamlessly. There was no tension between the UK and Australia, no fight for independence. If anything, Australia was a bit reluctant to become fully independent. It took them 11 years to ratify the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which was enacted by the British Parliament, and that gave international standing to what had until then been dominions of the empire. So loyalty to Britain has long roots and connections that have never been disrupted. But there was a significant change during World War II, when following the fall of Singapore, it became clear that British protection was no longer adequate. And this was when the shift to regarding the USA instead of Britain as a protector arose. At that time, of course, Japan was the enemy and fear of invasion was real. That's to say, the fear was real, although the threat of invasion was not. There's a famous propaganda poster of the time, which I'm going to show you in a moment, which depicts the Japanese heading south. And the government that issued this poster would have known that it was actually misinformation. In reality, the Japanese had ruled out any attempt to invade Australia because of the logistical difficulties of mounting the huge military operation that would have been required. So I'll show you the poster now with my screen sharing again. There we are. I haven't quite got it all in frame, but that's better. He's coming south. It's fight, work or perish. Useful poster from the point of view of getting the nation mobilized for the war effort, but actually telling a false story. Now, here it's worth, I want to just in passing mention the fact that Australia, as an island continent with plentiful natural resources and a well-educated and resourceful population 4 times the size it was during World War II, is actually an extremely safe place. That any invading force would have to cross water to conduct its invasion makes that a highly unlikely eventuality. And this safe nature of the nation stands in very stark contrast to its belligerent character. These two aspects, the geography and the culture, simply do not match one another. But what happened during World War II, what I think is significant, is that America woke up to the fact that Australia was strategically valuable as an excellent platform from which to mount its counteroffensive against Japan. So the Americans arrived here in force, and the populace was led to believe they'd been saved from the Japanese by them. And I'm sure the Americans, with their flair for public relations, would have actively encouraged that idea that they were the saviors, when the reality is that what they were doing was they could see the strategic benefit of using Australia as a base. Where the pattern was set, and it persists, the Australian people now had and still have a new protector in the USA. And as with Britain beforehand, to guarantee that this protection would never forget it, that their protector would never forget them and neglect their needs, Australia has shown willingness to join nearly every fight that the USA became engaged in. Firstly in Korea, followed by Vietnam, then Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. All of these campaigns were fought a long way from Australia. All were fought in countries that posed no threat to Australia, that were probably unable to pose any threat in any case. So they're all, to my mind, indicative of Australia's belligerence, its willingness to engage in military activity contrary to the UN Charter. And most significantly, all of these wars took place at the instigation of the USA, and incidentally, none of them has been decisive, except perhaps the Vietnam War. America's influence on Australia's military stance, which began during World War II, has continued and continues to grow stronger and stronger. So I'll give you a bit of a timeline. Back in 1951, the ANZUS Treaty between Australia, New Zealand, and the USA was signed. The common understanding is that this treaty means that the USA would protect Australia if needed. In actuality, it does nothing more than guarantee that the participating nations will consult with one another in the event of one of them coming under attack. The treaty was not invoked until 50 years after it was signed. In 1966, just moving forward, Australia entered into an agreement with the USA that saw the establishment of the spy base at Pine Gap. This base is hugely significant to the USA because it gives it surveillance over part of the globe that it could not otherwise surveil. What's more, its character has moved from defensive to offensive. Its original purpose of giving early warning of any missile launch from the old Soviet Union has morphed into providing real-time information, enabling the guidance of drones to striking countries such as Somalia and Pakistan, or wherever the USA might choose to. And this makes Australia complicit in drone strikes. In 1984, the governments of Australia and the USA began their ASIAL OSMIN talks. Now, these are talks that take place at ministerial level, and they take place alternately between the USA and Australia. I'll quickly show you a photo by screen sharing again. And this is, I'll make it a little bit bigger. Myself and a colleague outside the OSMIN talks in 2014. I made it a bit too big, never mind. Okay. Now, every year these Osmin talks take place, and every year what results is some strengthening of the agreement, some deeper commitment by Australia to the alliance with the USA. In 2001, our Prime Minister John Howard invoked the ANZUS Treaty for the first time, and so far the only time, and that was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the USA. Consequently, Australia joined the USA in the invasion of Afghanistan, and I would add, only left once the USA had decided it was time to leave. In 2003, despite the enormous public protests against it doing so, Australia, loyal to a fault, joined the infamous invasion of Iraq. Many of us doubted the validity of the story about weapons of mass destruction, and we of course were right to do so. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the fact that Australia, along with other nations, had been hoodwinked into joining the Iraq invasion, you'd be forgiven for thinking that might have damaged the level of trust between the USA and Australia. But not a bit of it. There wasn't even any hesitation as this process ground on. Because in 2011, President Obama visited Australia, and together with our then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, announced the USA's pivot to the Asia Pacific and the stationing of US Marines in Darwin. Now, when Obama was here, he addressed members of the Australian Defence Force in Darwin, and he said something that was very revealing. He told the ADF troops, "You can't tell where our guys end and you guys begin." So as time goes by, these words become more and more accurate. The two militaries are just being integrated with one another. There's less and less distinction between the ADF and the armed forces of the USA. Our officers hold senior positions within the US command structure. Our ships join US battle groups. We're the USA's biggest customer for military hardware, and we are constantly reminded of the supposed value and importance of interoperability between Australian and US forces. Now, for a small number of us, scattered all over Australia, having US Marines stationed in Darwin was taking the alliance one step too far. The government at the time, we felt, was making a big mistake by allowing armed foreigners under the command of the Pentagon to be stationed here on Australian sovereign territory. That, we felt, was a major mistake by our government. It provoked our scattered group into finding and establishing contact with one another. So a secondary mistake that the government made was that of bringing about the emergence of IPAN, the network that I'm part of. IPAN began to take shape during 2012-13, and in 2014, we held our first national conference in Canberra. At that time, the purchase of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter was an issue, and I'll just show you a picture of us protesting about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. There's me and this chap here is a ex-US Marine who was in Australia at the time and took part in our first conference. In 2015, IPAN had its second conference in Brisbane, and that was timed to coincide with the biannual Talisman Sabre military exercises, These exercises are huge. They're the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. They featured 34,000 military personnel in 2019. And following the 2015 conference, some of us traveled to central Queensland to engage in some non-violent direct action by trespassing on the military training area at a place called Shoalwater Bay. In 2016, we had our conference in Alice Springs in Central Australia, very close to Pine Gap. And the purpose was to draw attention to Pine Gap 50 years after the agreement that originally brought it into being. 5 people who entered the forbidden area eventually escaped any punishment. But again, I'll just screen share with you. I've got a photo here of them standing outside the courthouse in Alice Springs. I'll blow that up a bit. These are the 5 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, who were charged with trespass, but eventually they got away without going to prison or anything like that. Then in 2018, Australia announced its intention to become one of the world's top 10 armament suppliers. In other words, we're following America's example and getting into the weapons trade. So the government put out a sales catalogue of its weaponry that it had on sale, and we responded, and again I'll screen share, we responded by burning the catalogue in public in Sydney. So that's us burning the military sales catalogue. Then in 2019, it was revealed that Australia was the 2nd largest importer of weapons after the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. But it was during this period that we ran a campaign in opposition to the presence of the US Marines in Darwin. We really do feel that they should be kicked out. Now that campaign ran with the slogan, "Give them the boot." And in 2019, when IPAN had its conference in Darwin, we visited the barracks where the Marines were stationed, and we tried to physically give them a boot. We had no success, of course, but we did manage to raise a smile with the Australian soldiers on the gate. Now I'll screen share again. I hope this isn't too tedious. But here's the poster that we put out of that type, showing a sort of fictitious US Marine being kicked out and with the American flag being broken. That was the post that we put out. And I'll just scroll on through because here's a photo of us outside Robertson Barracks in the USA. That's where the US Marines are stationed. I'll blow that up a little bit. That's me on the right. On the left here, sorry, I made it a bit too big. On the left of the photo, this person here is one of our main supporters. He's a senator in the Australian Parliament, Senator Jordan Steele John. And he's still supporting us as time goes by. And one more photo to show you in this batch. Here is the boot that we attempted to give to the Marines. It's still in Darwin. I gave it to the little group in Darwin, and they can bring it out from time to time. And it's got names of all the participating groups on it. Okay. Now, I'm telling you all this to illustrate the point that over the years, there's been a very clear pattern of Australia's deeper and deeper enmeshment into the US-led military-industrial complex. It's a step-by-step, gradual, but relentless process under which the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, is being swallowed up, and Australia's militaristic character and its military resources are being enlisted to serve the USA's interests. During 2020 to 2021, to draw attention to this pattern and to gather the widest possible range of views on it, IPAN, which had grown in stature since 2013, or has grown in stature since 2013, IPAN has conducted a people's inquiry exploring the case for a peaceful and independent Australia. That inquiry is now finished. The process of gathering submissions is complete. And we've got an interim report out, and the full report is due to be published early in 2022. And we're quite optimistic about getting it tabled in the Senate. But the most significant development has happened during very recent months. And because it involves English-speaking nations exclusively, it has a strong echo of the colonial past. There's a new agreement between Australia, the UK, and the USA called AUKUS, A-U-K-U-S. Under it, Australia has agreed to more visits from US naval ships and military aircraft, more foreign troops on Australian territory, the storage of US military materiel and ordnance, and most controversially of all, the acquisition by Australia of nuclear-propelled submarines. Now, I needn't go into the details of why the AUKUS agreement is such a bad thing for Australia and the Southeast Asia region. What I do need to say is that this is just the next step in what has been an observable process that has been going on and on over many years now. There's never been any questioning about it at senior level as to why it is that Australia feels it must make the USA the cornerstone of its security, when in fact, we're under no military threat whatever, nor likely ever to come under one. Some have suggested that Australia's willingness to take part in US-led military excursions is like paying an insurance premium that brings the benefit of security. To me, it seems more like a protection racket under which Australia stands to be punished by the USA if it does not comply with its wishes. IPAN is currently in the throes of gathering together a variety of interest groups from across the nation to develop a national coalition of groups opposed to AUKUS. Next Saturday, I'll be taking part in a rally in Sydney, and over next weekend, there will be actions demonstrating opposition to AUKUS in all Australia's major cities. And I'll just again screen share with you and show you the banner that we have for next Saturday's protest. No nuclear subs, no AUKUS pact, no war on China. So let me summarize. Like the USA, Australia was founded on colonial violence and militarism. The USA is steeped in violence, and Australia appears to want to imitate its big brother. The violence of the USA was summarized in words from the Franciscan order in France in 1965. It was denouncing US policy in Vietnam, and it described a system which nourishes itself by means of war, which orientates itself towards war and profits handsomely from it. The US economy, I would contend, is dependent on the manufacture and sale of weapons. Its government is strongly influenced by lobbyists from multinational armaments traders. It has a vested interest in perpetual war. For its part, Australia appears intent on going down the same path. It appears to be unable to see any limit to the extent to which it will throw in its lot with this violent nation. But I hope that through AUKUS, we can tell our fellow countrymen that enough is enough and that AUKUS is where we draw the line. And that's where I finish. Thank you very much for listening.